mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Xtrem Mysteries.
LG텔레콤.
In the more than 50 years since their discovery, the Dead Sea Scrolls have provided scholars, theologians, and archaeologists with expanded understanding, heated conflicts, and ongoing controversy. Has technology thrown any new light on this 2,000-year-old mystery? We'll examine the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, perhaps of all time, the oldest known biblical manuscripts in existence, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is it possible that these scraps of ancient documents actually contain material that could alter or change the modern view of both Judaism and Christianity? Thousands of mutilated scroll fragments found in caves near the Dead Sea still remain not only untranslated, but unread. Will modern technology bring these ancient texts to life and give us an even closer look at the world in which Christ lived? Did the Copper Scroll point the way to a vast hidden treasure of untold wealth? Or is it just ancient folklore? And will the discovery of a second Copper Scroll finally point the way to the hoard of silver and gold? Are there still documents, perhaps even older than those already discovered, still buried under centuries of dust, or hidden in undiscovered chambers in the myriad caves near the ruins of Qumran? Is it possible that even the original text can yet be found, solving forever the mystery of the origin of the Old Testament of the Bible? Have new discoveries shed new light on Jewish mysticism and the origin of Christianity? Is there new evidence that the Old Testament, as found in our modern Bible, is truly accurate? What still lies hidden in the yet untranslated text, or in the unexplored caves on the edge of the Dead Sea? Some astonishing revelations when we return. At some point in the distant past, the entire Jordan Valley was a huge lake. Today, all that remains is a sunken pool of tepid brine known as the Dead Sea, and dotted along its shoreline are hundreds of caves situated precariously in what are now high, nearly inaccessible cliffs. The Bible tells us that even with 3,000 chosen men, King Saul could not find David in these caves, which gives us some idea of the number and inaccessibility of the caves. Imagine, then, the degree of luck involved when a Bedouin shepherd, throwing rocks in an attempt to startle any lost sheep in the dark recesses of one of the caves, stumbled onto the archaeological find of the century. A cache of ancient documents that would change forever the course of biblical scholarship and our understanding of the ancient prophets. The Bedouins were disappointed at first. They found nothing but old clay pots with smelly, decaying rolls of leather inside. They may have recognized there was writing on one of the skins, but none of them could read. Still, they decided to keep the stuff. Maybe the leather wasn't too old to make good straps. The Bedouins were not unfamiliar with the antiquities of the desert, however, and eventually the scrolls made their way to Bethlehem in the shop of a sometimes cobbler and part-time dealer in ancient artifacts, a man called Kando. Kando recognized the antiquity of the scrolls and realized they might have value to scholars. He took them to the Archbishop of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, who promptly bought 4 of the original 7 scrolls and sold them in the United States by means of a simple want ad. As luck, or perhaps providence would have it, however, he sold them to an Israeli who brought them back to Israel.
I was the first American to see these scrolls. It happened in 1948 when the scrolls were brought to me in Jerusalem for evaluation and later for photographing. I immediately recognized they were from the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. The oldest one is the now famous Isaiah A scroll. Historically, these scrolls are priceless. It was indeed the greatest biblical manuscript discovery of all time.
Scholars now had authentic texts at least 1,000 years older than any previously known. Would they confirm or contradict the Old Testament of the modern Bible?
This discovery and the eventual sale of those first scrolls led to a scroll rush instead of a gold rush. And of course, this led archaeologists to 10 other caves right there in the same area. Once their value was understood, the Bedouins competed with archaeologists to find more scrolls. While the archaeologists were excavating various caves there in Qumran, the Bedouins were just yards away in Cave 4, where over 800 scrolls were discovered of the Old Testament, and it represented every book found therein with the exception of Esther. Over 50 years have passed since the world-shaking discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but most people are probably unfamiliar with the 5 decades of controversy that have swirled around their dissemination and interpretation. Almost everyone knows about the scrolls, but very few people understand how they influence our understanding of the origin of Christianity, or how these very same scrolls validate, if you will, the Hebrew Bible itself. For the first time in history, scholars had an authentic new perspective of Judaism, if you will, as it existed at the time of Jesus.
Could it be that the words on these ancient documents had the power to alter the course of history and challenge the faith of both Jews and Christians the world over? Is that why the scrolls have been so tightly guarded?
In 1953, an international team of young scholars was assembled in Jerusalem to begin sorting out the thousands of fragments. Most of the early scrolls were easily readable by those who knew Hebrew, or in one case Aramaic, and by 1958, Israeli and American scholars had published the 7 intact scrolls from the original find. But from that point on, virtually everything discovered was not readily translated and released to the public. The original group involved found the project too daunting, and some even died before completing their work.
Aside from their suddenly acquired monetary value, what was there about these ancient rolls of lambskin that made archaeologists and Bedouin shepherds alike dig through sometimes 8 feet of bat dung and scorpion nests to find even the tiniest scraps?
The scrolls contain manuscripts of every Old Testament book except Esther, plus manuscripts of the period that gave birth to modern-day Christianity as well as Judaism. Prior to these discoveries, the oldest nearly complete edition of the Old Testament dated back to 890 AD. But the Dead Sea Scrolls go back to as far as 200 BC. This brings our knowledge of the biblical text 1,100 years closer to the time these events actually took place.
Scholars and theologians now had further evidence that the modern Old Testament was not only known but revered at the time of Christ. Even more astonishing, the scrolls also proved that in spite of thousands of years and hundreds of translations, the text had remained essentially unchanged.
Physically, the scrolls bring us 1,000 years closer to the actual events. But informationally, they bring us even closer than that. The Bible you purchase today may have been printed in 1987, but the text found therein was written thousands of years ago. In exactly the same way, the 2,000-year-old manuscripts found in the caves of Qumran were copied in 200 BC, but the text was written hundreds of years before that.
All of which highlights yet another controversy surrounding the scrolls. Who did write them and hide them in the caves? Were they copied by scribes in the nearby community of Qumran? Or were they, as some scholars suggest, part of the temple library in Jerusalem brought to the caves for protection from the Roman invaders?
The majority theory today, and generally accepted as proven fact, is the Essene theory. Most Qumran scholars are persuaded that the 800 manuscripts found so far are the product of scribes living at Qumran, whose only task was to faithfully copy their sacred writings. But there are those who insist the Qumran scrolls are in fact the library of the Jerusalem temple, hidden there by the temple priests during the first Jewish revolt against Rome. Indeed, Professor Norman Galb of the University of Chicago goes so far as to claim that there was no Qumran sect, and in fact the ruins of Qumran had nothing to do with the scrolls found in the adjacent caves. However, the evidence seems to favor the scholarly consensus that the scrolls are the product of a community of Essenes living at Qumran. But the theory does have a few problems. First of all, not all the scrolls discovered so far have been found near Qumran, and the discovery of the now famous copper scroll may also challenge the Essene theory. This scroll appears to be the testimony of a community that possessed amazing wealth, while the Essenes were required to give up all their worldly possessions when they joined the sect.
It seems apparent that the Dead Sea Scrolls can shed an enormous amount of light on some very old and contentious arguments about the age and authorship of the Old Testament and about the rise of Christianity. But for reasons still unclear, it wasn't until 1991, and after considerable struggle, that most of the untranslatable texts were finally made available to all scholars. What was it that kept the scrolls from being published for nearly 40 years?
That's a question that has still not been answered. For instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls did not fulfill any wild expectations that some may have had. There were no lost or hidden books when it came to the scrolls. Regarding biblical text, however, we find amazing accuracy. The scrolls do tell us more about Judaism at the time of the Second Temple period than we have ever known before. They tell us what people accepted as scripture before there was an officially sanctioned Bible, and they provide a unique insight into a world ripped apart by religious and social upheaval. But if Judaism or Christianity has anything to fear from the publication of the scrolls, it remains undiscovered. There appears to be no rational reason whatsoever why text translation was withheld.
The saga of the Dead Sea Scrolls has been going on for over 50 years, and it cannot be said with certainty that the most important documents have been found. What still lies hidden in the man-made caves that have yet to be excavated? Could it be that archaeologists or the ever-vigilant Bedouin will yet uncover older, even more sacred documents? Is it possible that the scrolls discovered so far represent only a fraction of the library of the Second Temple? Does the vast complex of caves still hide the original writings of Ezekiel, Daniel, even Moses? And what exactly is on the Copper Scroll?
It may sound like something out of a Steven Spielberg movie, but basically the Copper Scroll tells where to find buried treasure. And the scroll is talking about real treasure, gold and silver, bars, bullion, and coins, the kind of things that would make us all wealthy.
Can 21st century technology help us shed some light on these questions? We'll find out in just a moment. In 1991, the Dead Sea Scrolls finally made it out of the darkness of the caves and into the light of scholarship and study. The Huntington Library of California made available to all scholars the photographic security copies of all the scrolls on deposit in its vault, making it possible for the first time for worldwide study of the documents so far discovered. Later that same year, the Biblical Archaeological Society published a computer-generated version as well as a 2-volume edition of photographs. And closing the circle, the Israel Antiquities Authority also announced that it would issue an authorized microfiche edition complete with detailed indices. Historians, theologians, archaeologists, and linguists all now have access to these ancient texts. But does that mean that's all there is?
For many years, it was assumed that there were no more scrolls. The consensus was that the Bedouins had taken everything. We now know that was not the case. Recently, the transcript of a lost Dead Sea Scroll, a religious text called the Angel Scroll, mysteriously surfaced in Jerusalem. Its author describes a vision in which an angel takes him on a tour of the heavens. And according to Muhammad el-Deeb, the first of the Bedouins to search for the scrolls, there are even more scrolls waiting in unexcavated caves, even a unique scroll that can be read with the fingers. Professor John Strugnell, one of the original scroll team members, claims to have seen 2 scrolls now in private hands, one of which is a complete book of Enoch. An exciting development of which I've had a part is the search for underground repositories through ground-penetrating radar and other technologies. At our site on the Qumran Plateau, we are investigating detected anomalies, which we believe may be paleo chambers, man-made caves located some 50 feet below the surface, entered by a concealed passageway. There's no doubt that such structures would have been designed to hide something of great value, and that is what we are seeking to confirm.
American researchers Dr. Gary Collette and Audrey Richardson, using molecular frequency analysis equipment, further confirmed that the solidly sealed cave was approximately 40 feet below the surface and measured about 12 feet by 15 feet in size. Readouts from their equipment are said to reveal that in the cave are indications of jars with parchments, pottery, leather, wood, various metals, and a copper object, possibly the second copper scroll.
It's entirely possible that the new cave scrolls will be the most significant Dead Sea Scrolls ever discovered. Otherwise, why would the priests or scribes go through such efforts to hide them? It is certainly not beyond the realm of possibility that these caves just might be the repository for the original manuscripts of the Old Testament of the Bible.
But scroll researchers have learned that finding the scrolls is only the beginning of the problem. After all, if they can't be read, they're still lost. In fact, the scrolls that remain hidden in the desert wastes may be better off than those that have been discovered. Since being brought out of their 2,000-year-old hiding places, many of the fragments have begun to darken, rendering them not only more fragile, but unreadable. Being able to read these fragments could mean the difference between having a complete or a partial document, between knowledge and supposition.
Two recent innovations for studying the scrolls are the use of digitized infrared photography and remote sensing techniques. The application of digital imaging technology, much of which was unavailable 5 years ago, now makes it possible to enhance previously unreadable scroll fragments. We take the infrared photographs, scan them into the computer, and proceed to enhance and clarify the digitized image for easier reading. On the computer screen, this Targum of Job is impossible to read. After enhancement, it becomes readable in a color or black and white version. Also, we can take difficult to read characters or sections and computer enhance these particular areas and electronically paste them on an enhanced background for translation and study.
The application of these new technologies is raising the hopes of scroll researchers and scholars that fragments can not only be retrieved from obscurity, but actually pieced together and ultimately inserted into the proper text.
This scroll of Job has some degraded areas and many fragments that have been separated from the scroll itself. Here, we're enhancing some of the degraded areas and taking one of the separate fragments, enhancing it and fitting it into the correct line text. And as you can see, it fits perfectly with half of one character on the fragment with the other half on the scroll itself. Although infrared photography has helped read thousands of scroll fragments, vast numbers remain virtually unreadable.
This desert wasteland on the shores of the world's most brine-encrusted body of water is barely 15 miles from Jerusalem, where some scholars still believe the scrolls actually originated. It seems apparent that there are many more archaeological and biblical treasures yet to be found. But what about the kind of thing most of us think about when we hear of buried treasure? Will desert sands give up the millions, some say even $1 billion, in gold, silver, and other artifacts identified in the Copper Scroll? The Copper Scroll is unique among the discoveries of Qumran, and not only because it's made of metal rather than papyrus or vellum. It is also unique in content and in character.
Everything about the Copper Scroll is mysterious or controversial. It is not made up of animal skin, nor is it made up of papyrus. It is actually made up of the metal copper. It is a thin sheet just short of 8 feet long and 12 inches wide, made up of smaller sheets of copper foil riveted together. It was found by an archaeologist, not a Bedouin, and it was on a shelf instead of in one of the earthen jars. When it was discovered in March of 1952, it consisted of 2 separate rolls of badly oxidized copper that crumbled to the touch. Initial efforts to open it failed.
No one seemed particularly excited about what might be on the Copper Scroll. It was routinely assigned to team member Dr. J.T. Millick for publication, but no one, it seemed, was very interested in taking on what seemed an impossible task. Then another member of the team, John Allegro, suggested the scroll be sent to Manchester College, where he was teaching. Unfortunately, no one at the university there was interested in the project either. Then, a colleague suggested he try the Manchester College of Science and Technology. There, Dr. H. Wright Baker devised a unique solution. Instead of trying to unroll it, he simply cut the scroll layer by layer, creating 23 hemispherical slices from the two rolls. The work was completed in January of 1956, nearly 4 years from the time the scroll was discovered. Now the scroll could be deciphered, and that's when the fun began.
Much to everyone's surprise, the copper scroll contained detailed descriptions of vast treasures found throughout the city. It even gave us directions as to where these treasures might be found. For example, as it translates literally from the scroll, on Mount Gerizim, under the stairs of the higher underground cavity, a box and its contents and 60 talents of silver. At the mouth of the spring of Bethsham, vessels of silver and vessels of gold, of offering and silver, in all 600 talents. In the great underground duct of the sepulchral chamber towards the house of the sepulchral chamber, the whole weighing 71 talents and 20 minas. No one today knows the modern equivalent of talents and minas, but it's possible that a talent could weigh from 25 to 75 pounds. Scholars do agree, however, that the amount of this treasure could be staggering, up to $1 billion.
Dr. Allegro was the first to read the copper scroll. He determined the treasures must be real, since the descriptions were unaccompanied by any fanciful stories or references. It was just a straightforward listing of items and the amounts and their location. A search for the treasure was launched, but so far, nothing has been found. Dr. Millick and some of his other colleagues are not surprised. They concluded the very enormity of the treasure described in the scroll meant it was nothing more than folklore. And in fact, the references in the scroll are so obscure, they could just be fictional.
No one, of course, knows who is correct, but the designations in the copper scroll appear to be listed in geographical order. And most of the sites seem to be located around Jerusalem and in the Jericho-Qumran area, the most likely places such treasure would be hidden. But there's something else. The final site on the list is particularly intriguing. It reads, "In the underground cavity, which is in the smooth rock north of Coquelet, whose opening is towards the north with tombs at its mouth, there is a copy of this writing and its explanation and the measurements and the details of each item." Now, if we only knew where Coquelet was.
Could it be that the copper object still lying hidden in what appears to be a sealed underground room near Qumran is the second copper scroll referred to? The unrest in the Mideast has prevented aggressive follow-up by scholars, archaeologists, and theologians alike. But even without any new discoveries, there are thousands of scroll fragments still to be pieced together and studied. Is it possible the greater treasure will be found in these shattered pieces?
While new discoveries of old scrolls are not being made at the moment, new discoveries in the old scrolls are another story. Scrolls and texts that have been unreadable are giving up their knowledge into the intense scrutiny of new technologies. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is far from over.
Are there sealed rooms that can add to the already immense treasure of knowledge and understanding already given up by the caves on the shores of the Dead Sea? Now that the scrolls are generally available to the worldwide scholarly community, what exciting new discoveries lie in wait for intrepid researchers? Will someone find new clues to the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold and silver supposedly buried in long-forgotten hiding places? Out of all the questions, only one fact has emerged. The biblical text, as the world knows it today, remains intact and 1,000 years closer to its origin than ever before. For many people in the world, perhaps that's enough. Something to think about.